Hello, my name is Oscar Castorena. Today I'm presenting the paper titled How Worried Should We Be? The Implications of Fabricated Survey Data for Political Analysis. This is co-authored work with Molly Cohen, Noam Lupu, and Elizabeth Zechmeister. As survey researchers, we care a lot about the quality of our data. We're aiming to make inferences about a population of interest using a sample of responses, and in order for those inferences to be of use and valid, we need those responses to be accurately recorded. And with this in mind, LabPop, we've invested considerable resources into our quality control processes for our face-to-face surveys that are administered across the Americas. And because of this infrastructure, we were able to detect a large number of fraudulent interviews during the fieldwork of the Venezuela 2016 survey. And we were able to detect these during fieldwork and replace them with genuine interviews. And so all of this data allows us to ask questions about fabrication that arise in the survey research literature. Specifically, what are the patterns of fabricated data relative to real data? What are the implications for public opinion research? And how do interviews go about faking data? So first, let me discuss or describe the data we're working with. So this was data that was collected from a nationally representative survey of Venezuela in 2016, or specifically it was the end of 2016 at fieldwork that went on to the beginning of 2017. And throughout the course of fieldwork, we were able to detect a high prevalence of fraudulent interviews. And this is in the context of a lot of political unrest and insecurity that created incentives for interviewers to fabricate their face-to-face surveys. And we were able to detect these through our Falcon quality control procedures. The Falcon quality control procedure basically centers around the use of handheld devices to collect survey responses, and which allows us to collect a whole bevy of data on the interview, including the location, recordings, pictures that allow us to verify whether an interview is fraudulent or not. Through this quality control process, we were able to detect 460 interviews that we coded as likely fraudulent. These are interviews where the interviewer intentionally fabricated responses rather than conduct a genuine interview with an actual respondent. And we took these likely fraudulent interviews and matched them with clean interviews that in the data set, in the final validated data set. And using this matching procedure, which matched on the location, the sex, and age of the respondent, we have 420 fraudulent interviews matched with 420 clean interviews, which we can directly compare, and we can also make comparisons between our full clean validated data set and a counterfactual compromised data set that includes both clean and these what would have been these 400 or so fraudulent interviews had they not been replaced. So we first compare our fake interviews with their matched genuine interviews in terms of univariate analyses. So in order to do this, we looked at items in the survey with ordinal response scales. And so of these 113 items, there are only 13 with significant differences between the clean and fraudulent matched interviews in terms of the mean. And so of those 13 where there are these significant differences, when we're comparing the full clean validated data set and the counterfactual compromised data set, and the mean values that you would generate from those data sets for these items, there's 0 with significant differences. And there's even fewer differences in terms of non-response and variance of responses for these 113 items. And so for the most part, the response patterns are very similar across, the counterfactual compromised data set and a clean final validated data set. And while there are very little differences in terms of univariate analyses, as social scientists, we're mostly concerned with multivariate analyses. And so we want to examine, how does widespread fabrication affect the inferences in the relationships between variables. And so to look at this, we took a standard model of support for democracy, which is of interest to political scientists. And so we took standard predictors of support for democracy from the literature, and we ran this analysis using our clean validated data set and also using the counterfactual compromised data set, which includes those fabricated responses had they not been replaced. And so the result is that you have results that are largely the same. Coefficients in one model are statistically indistinguishable from the coefficients in another model, and we arrive at the same conclusions using both data sets as far as the relationships between these different variables and the variable of interest, which is support for democracy. And so these results lead us to the question of how is it that the interviewer's fabricated responses are so similar to genuine responses? And so in order to address that question, we have to understand the motivations and constraints that interviewers face in the course of fieldwork. And so our data suggests that it isn't wholesale fabrication that interviewers are doing. They're not fabricating all of their interviews. They're only fabricating a portion of their interviewers, and this would suggest that fabrication is done to sort of supplement genuine interviews in the course of fieldwork, which can be very, very difficult, and especially in conditions such as Venezuela in late 2016, where there was a lot of political unrest and a lot of scarcity and a lot of resulting insecurity, and that would motivate interviewers to avoid having to conduct as many interviews, and also make it difficult for them to get interviews, and so that leads to a lot of fabrication. And this is also, consistent with our data in the sense that, a lot of their fraudulent responses are disproportionately more male and more younger and middle-aged, which are kinds of respondents that are much more difficult to find in face-to-face surveys. And their uploads of fraudulent responses are later in the day compared to clean or genuine interviewers, again suggesting that interviewers are supplementing their genuine work with fraudulent interviews. And this all indicates that fabricators have experience with genuine responses and can draw on this experience when they're fabricating or making up interviews so that they do mimic what real responses would look like. We believe it's the ability of interviewers to rely on these experiences with genuine responses that that they can generate such plausible fabrications, especially when compared to what one would expect from the fabrication strategies discussed in the literature, not only in the literature on interview fabrication on the part of enumerators, but also in the satisficing literature. So one exercise we do in the paper is we compare our genuine fakes to simulated data that follows these other fabrication strategies, whether they be, random selection of a response, responses towards the middle of a scale, so responses that are normally distributed around the middle of a scale, or speeding strategy where the numerator is simply going through the survey as quickly as possible. And so to generate that data, we relied on undergraduate RAs to go through the survey using the handheld device as quickly as possible and use those responses to create a speed data set. And so we have these other data sets following these other fabrication strategies, and just as with our genuine fakes, we can compare them to the genuine, clean, validated responses and see how much they differ, and see how much those differences compare to the differences with the genuine fake data. And we do this for similar to the analysis with the univariate analyses. And so here what you can see is the first column called faked. Those are the comparisons with the genuine faked data that I discussed earlier, where there was very little differences between the matched fake and genuine interviews. But you see there's far greater differences in all the other fabrication strategies using the simulated data. Random response, speeding, or milling responses results in much more higher percentage of items where there's a significant difference in the means, and also larger differences in terms of the magnitude of those differences and in terms of the standard deviation. Much more items where there's significant differences in the items, in the variances between that fake data and the genuine responses, and also for the items where it would be applicable in the item non-response. So all of these other fabrication strategies would result in far greater differences than what we actually see with fake data. And so the fabrication that interviewers are doing is far more sophisticated than a lot of these simplified fabrication strategies. And we argue that this is in part because they are drawing on their knowledge of genuine responses. So to conclude, we were able to draw on this particular case where there was widespread data fabrication, where we would have represented a large portion of the final sample to really assess how much fabrication would affect our inferences. And what we see is there's little to no differences in estimates generated from the compromised data versus the clean validated data, and that we discussed this more in the paper. There might be some reason for concern when making very fine-grained comparisons, but for the most part, our conclusions for whether it be univariate or multivariate analyses are essentially the same. And moreover, we see that fabricators are likely relying on their knowledge of genuine responses to create plausible responses, and so this is likely what drives those similarities, and we don't see very stark differences, which probably would have been the case that they followed one of these more standard fabrication strategies that are suggested in the fabrication and satisficing literature. Thank you for listening.